From passive participation to passionate creation, discover how to empower your students in music class. This podcast tackles 4 key mistakes to avoid when fostering student ownership, equipping you with strategies to ignite their musical spark.
Welcome to Pass the Baton, Empowering Students in Music Education. Here, we amplify the voices of music teachers around the world who are passing the baton and creating environments where the music students are empowered. Together, we can help students transform from passive consumers to vibrant creatives. Welcome back to the Pass the Baton podcast. I'm Kathryn Finch.
And I'm Theresa Hoover. We're so glad that you are here with us today.
Yeah. Well, Theresa, it's been a little bit, but I have not talked to you in detail about AMEA. How was AMEA?
Oh, yeah, it was good. The Arizona Music Educator Conference was, the beginning of February. So yeah, it's been a
while
time since we've had a chance to talk, but it was a good little conference. Arizona has a neat variety of things going on in the state. So it was kind of cool to see, the various choral and band and general music and mariachi and just all kinds of neat things like that going on at the conference. I presented 2 sessions. The first one was all about Google stuff, which I love.
I do too.
Some of my favorite things to present about, just like little Google tricks to help people be more organized. There were some oohs and ahs during that session, which is always fun.
Yeah.
And then I also presented one session about voice and choice in ensembles, which it actually went really well. I was a little nervous. I wasn't really sure if Arizona was ready for voice and choice, but it went well. And actually, Kathryn, it was that session that kind of spurred my interest in recording today's episode. Because as I was putting together like these ideas of how you can really incorporate voice and choice and think about student ownership in ensembles, I was thinking about like some of we'll call them mistakes that sometimes we make by accident, right? A mistake is usually done. It's not something we're intending. We don't always do what we mean. So some little mistakes that can occur and the things that we want to make sure we avoid when we're thinking about this topic of student ownership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's get started. What are some things that you were thinking that we should try to avoid?
Yeah. Okay. So the first mistake, I think, is asking for student voice and then not listening to it. This idea that we ask students for their thoughts, we ask for their opinions, we want to know what they're interested in, what's important to them, all of that information, and then we just kind of put it in our back pocket and don't do anything with the information. So we ask for the student voice, but then it doesn't make any impact.
Yeah. And Theresa, I think many of our listeners probably can relate. I know I can to, this is not just exclusive to like happening to students or to your learners in your classroom, but like, have we ever been to a PD or a staff meeting or something in some time in our career where we were part of a committee and then then everything just went a different direction, and like just how that feels to be in that position, but it's not a good thing.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It definitely has happened to us as teachers. And like I said, I don't think it's usually intentional.
Oh, no, I don't think so.
I think
things happen.
But I think it's something that happens, right? So like in the classroom, that could be, giving students a feedback survey and then not considering what the responses are, not doing anything with the responses, or asking students about the kind of music they're interested in, what things they want to learn, but then going, well, we're gonna do it my way instead. Mm-hmm. I think that's just it happens, right? So if we're thinking about, we're not going to just make this an episode about all the things that might be going wrong, right? We want to make sure that we're thinking like, okay, so what do we do about this, right? And really the first thing is just being intentional. When you ask for students' opinions, when you ask them, what they want to learn about, to give feedback on something that you're doing in the classroom, use the information. So try to find some way to incorporate what you're learning from students in what you're doing and how you're moving forward with your classroom. And I know, Kathryn, sometimes I've heard you talk about like just even acknowledging it to the students that you've heard what they say, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, oftentimes I'll make a list that I can then go back and reference of, because how do you remember all the things, right? And every class is
Mm-hmm.
different. And so yeah, I definitely write out things for myself, kind of make notes so that when I'm thinking about it, I can certainly go back and reference, and then also reference with students. Hey, remember you said that this was something you wanted to do. We're going to do this
Yeah.
today. Just kind of point it out, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember when we were writing the book, you also talked about sometimes the students would ask for something pretty outlandish.
Yeah, a bathtub. I think a bathtub was asked for in the music room, and I was like, "Wow."
Right. But did you
um,
still acknowledge that it was said and then
yeah,
explain?
they saw it. Yeah, it was. I mean, I collected all the answers, and I went over all of, or not answers, but like all those the survey I took. I collected it and I shared it with the kids, so they easily could see that like a green screen did make it into the room, and I saw a recording studio, but a bathtub did not.
Yeah. But I think just going through that, like you're acknowledging it, saying, while this is a could be a fun idea, it's not something that's going to work right now, you know. And
Mhm.
so I think that acknowledgement piece is big because that student knows that you at least heard them.
Yeah.
And you know, whether you thought about it for a second or 5 minutes or not at all, it was still something that you considered. Um, yeah, so I think just really being intentional if you're going to ask for their feedback, and I don't even want to say if, when you ask for their feedback, thinking about how you're going to respond to it. I love your idea of making a list. I think that's perfect. Um, and really just being open, right? Being open to thinking about where could this go? Well, you know, I hadn't thought about taking it this direction, but a bunch of kids seem to think it would be a good idea. How could we make that happen? Or asking the students, you suggested that we add a scene in the play that's like this. Tell me more. Like, what could
Hmm.
this look like? How could we make this happen?
Hmm.
And then if the kid goes, oh, I don't know, I wasn't really thinking about it, then you go, okay, maybe we don't put too much effort. But if you find out that they really did have some good ideas,
For sure.
it
Yeah.
could be worthwhile.
And I think also some of it too is just um like being present with your kids and really listening to them, because sometimes in the moment they're trying to tell you something, that if you listen and stop for a second, like you might be able to bring their voices in at the moment, for
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely. Um, so one of our past guests, Shane Calhoun, it's episode 53. He had some good thoughts about this topic.
But what I noticed was in between the moments when I'm out the room grabbing a quarter, I turn my back, these kids would start doing like praise and worship band because they're all from the black church. And they're, nah, 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 and next, they break out with a shout. And I said, imagine if I just came back and said, hey, teach me a little bit about that. Student centered. It's using the voice, hearing the voice of the students. In the presentation, I talked about, in my opinion, the 5 most important questions we could ask. And to me, number 1 is, what would you like to learn about music?
Mm-hmm.
Loaded question, scary question. We don't have the time to actually address everything in the question, but that's the starting point. Simply asking the kids, what would you like to learn?
Yeah.
Powerful. And, you know, what's kind of neat is when Shane was talking about the first part of that, how it would just be students who would be playing, and you know, could I just ask them to teach me about that? It wasn't even something formal that was happening, right? It wasn't a exit ticket. It wasn't a survey. It wasn't any of those things. It was just Shane in the moment realizing that his students were telling him something.
Yeah, it's funny because it's like what I said before of like, just listen to your students and you're going to
Yeah.
hear from them. It's like, that's an exact example. Like
Mm-hmm.
he was present and was like, wait, what are they doing? Wait, whoa, this is
Mm-hmm.
something I should be, we should be talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. And then what would you like to learn about music?
Yeah.
It's simple.
And scary, except for like,
Yes.
if you just take the step, though, it is manageable. You just have to ask and listen, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. You ready for mistake number 2 to avoid?
Yeah.
All right, we're going to call this one the illusion of choice.
Okay.
And with this, it's only offering what we're going to call superficial opportunities for choice. So only offering student choice in a way that you have carefully curated the options, because unfortunately that's kind of a replacement, for actual choice. And I think, Kathryn, you were talking about how we've felt this as teachers. I've totally felt this as teachers. It's like the day that you have PD and they say, okay, you can go to the math PD or the reading PD. And you go, but I'm a music teacher. And they're like, yeah, we're giving you a choice. And you're thinking to yourself, well, like, neither of those choices is what I want to do. So it's kind of that similar option that, if you're only ever letting students choose between things that you have chosen that match your interests, your needs, all of those things, then we're not really giving students an authentic opportunity to make their own choices and an authentic opportunity to choose something that's meaningful to them.
Yeah. That's a big one, right? Like, yeah, because it's, yeah.
So I think I have to make sure I say this properly. You're going to probably need to start with that kind of choice, right? If your students have never had any choices before, you will probably need to start with something that's been teacher selected. But think about how you can move from that to start incorporating their voices and their ideas. So maybe at the beginning, as you're scaffolding, you say, okay, you can pick between these two things. And then maybe the next class it's, okay, so you can choose between these two things. And does anybody have a good third option, right? Asking, does anyone else have thoughts? And you're gradually building in some student selected options. Other ways to think about it is just saying to the kids, okay, we're going to be doing this assignment. What are three things that you think people should be able to choose from, and see if they can offer ideas. Or other things I've done even is I'll say, okay, maybe it's for an assessment. I want you to prove to me that you are confident playing songs in the notes of concert B flat. You could pick between this song, or if you have a better idea for option 3, let me know. Mm-hmm. So I'm giving them some choices, but then I'm also leaving the door open but if you have something else that you'd like to try, let's chat.
Yeah. And I also think that's fair too, that if for the learner experience, if they're not used to being able to make choices, it is good to have to this or this, because if you give them or give, that and or give me something else that you think you would do. Because some kids can right away think of something that would be, pertain to what you want and make a lot of sense. And others would really struggle with that, and maybe need the this or this, but that's just at the beginning, once you're kind of getting them going with that and they're used to what that feels like. And
just not sticking with only the teacher option, I think is where the mistake happens. The mistake is not, ever giving teacher options, but it's just a matter of you don't want to stay there forever.
There. Yeah. Yeah. And also, I think that also because kids will start to learn how they do best and won't want to stay there with those two choices. They're going to want to be like, well, I do well if I am able to do a video, or right. Like there's just going to be, once the kids kind of understand themselves a little bit better, they're going to be able to tell you what they need.
Yeah. And I think they can start thinking about what their interests are and how that can feed in. They're thinking about, let's say it's a project where they need to produce some kind of a deliverable at the end. You could say, hey class, what do you think? What are some different ways that we could prove that we understand this concept? And one kid might say, I could make a video, and somebody else might say, I could do PowerPoint slides. And so they're kind of providing those options themselves, instead of you saying, okay, you can choose between a video, PowerPoint, or I don't know, a book report or something like that. Yeah, they're starting to be able to build the capacity to think that way. And I think that's what we want, right? A lot of our goals here, we're helping the students move to becoming these independent learners, independent musicians. They have to be able to think that way and make choices in that way.
Yeah.
So way back in episode 3, this was a long time ago, we had Laura Johnson on to talk about student selected repertoire. And I think this was such a perfect example of that. So let's listen to a quick clip from Laura.
So with discussions, before really doing anything, I would take some class time with my students and talk about what constitutes good programming. What do we like about music? What sets a good piece of music apart from something maybe that isn't as good? And we also talked about our ability level, both as an ensemble and as an individual. And I included myself in that process. Even though I'm not playing with them, I might say, well, as a clarinet player, I really struggle with higher range notes. I can play anything low, but when I have to go above the staff, it's not my favorite. So that would be something I have to work on, kind of to get them comfortable talking about areas of development that they might have. And having those conversations helps them, one, to understand this process, how we find repertoire, how we pick what's good, what maybe isn't as good, and also how we look at ourselves. Should I be picking a grade 4 piece when my ensemble plays grade 2? Probably not. Should I pick a piece where it's a trumpet feature and I only have 2 trumpets that maybe aren't confident for something like that? You know, really getting into the nitty-gritty of what do we need to work on, where are we at, and what do we like as an ensemble? And taking just a little bit of each class, not one whole class, just a couple minutes each day and talking about some of those things. So then once we did that, we would make a criteria list together of what are we looking for when we're looking for a piece of music. If I sent you off to go find something, what do we need? So that list could have, you know, those checks for quality. That could be, is it repetitive? Is it not repetitive? Does it feature more than one instrument? Does it not? Whatever we decided together, it's a collaborative effort.
Yeah. A couple things popped out at me of just how standards rich that example was. I mean, that kind of activity meets our national court standards really well, in the sense the kids are making their own criteria and, you know, they are doing the work for sure. But I also popped out to me that, like, that was not a superficial opportunity for those kids. That was a really deep dive into a purposeful task.
Yeah,
Learning.
absolutely. And the way that she worked with them, she said, you know, a couple minutes each class period, just talking about those things and allowing the students to learn more about what goes into choosing repertoire, I think is such a valuable thing for them as musicians, as learners, all of the things. Okay. Mistake number 3. And, you know, this actually has, it makes me think a little bit of number 2 as well. So mistake number 3 is, has to do with creating, right? When we give students opportunities for creating, either giving them too much guidance or not enough, you know, too many parameters or not enough parameters. And I think that is a trap that we can fall into. And it reminds me of this idea of choice, either giving only your choices or like not giving them enough background knowledge to make good choices on their own. So I think of, like, when I see these examples of this, it's often when the students are creating something and they all look exactly alike at the end. They're like cookie cutters of each other. That's a great example of when maybe the students were given too many parameters, too much explicit instruction on what to create and how to do it. But then on the flip side of that, telling students, create something can sometimes be a little bit too ambiguous to really have purpose in what they're doing.
Yeah. And it takes a little time to kind of figure out where is that in between, right? But
yeah. And I think, you know, for me, the kind of the way I deal with that is making sure that any creative activities do have purpose. And I use that purpose for the basis for what the students are going to do. For me, a lot of times the creative activities are going to align. If I'm in like a performance ensemble, they're going to align with what we're learning in preparation for performing things. So, you know, if we're working in a particular key, maybe I would say that, okay, the melody I want you to create should also be in that key. So now the students are reinforcing, okay, so what's the key signature? What do I know about this particular key? How do I and they're taking that information and putting that into what they create, right?
Mhm.
So I'm thinking about like, what's the purpose and how can I use that to provide some guidance? I also have always loved this concept of, providing the floor but not the ceiling. So we're saying, put this in the key of concert A flat, but I'm not going to say you're only limited to these 5 notes, or you're only limited to an octave. I'm going to allow students to do what's comfortable for them. Because what you'll find is that when you have the basic guidance, students will rise to their ability level and they will push themselves to the level that's most appropriate for them. And I think that can be, just a really helpful thing when you're working with students. If I had said, oh, you're only limited to 1 octave, well, I've got a kid over here who really knows much more than that. That student isn't going to be able to put his full potential into that piece of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like that's where the differentiation comes in, right? Where you can really kind of meet kids where they are at, like you said, but it supports everybody at the beginning, for sure. Like, it supports everybody to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also like, this thought of, having students explain why they did what they did, right? So if we're saying, okay, I want you to write a melody that fits within a waltz style. Okay. So now we put those little parameters in. Okay. It's got to be in 3 and it should probably, just little things like that to show that they understand waltz. But then if a student creates a composition saying like, oh, this is wonderful. Why did you make that musical decision? What were you thinking about when you did this? It's going to also help you know, do they understand waltz style? Do they understand this particular key? Just to get to know the student a little bit more and get to know what they're thinking about as they are creating. Again, it kind of goes back to that purpose. Like, are they meeting the purpose of the activity?
Mm-hmm.
You want to hear an example?
Yeah.
or from a podcast? Okay, so let's go. We're going back in time again. So Sonia Nussin, episode 13, was talking a lot about creativity.
It's this color, and that was all her own doing. We didn't say, oh, you must do this. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we do. So sometimes there'll be very tight guidelines, and part of that is so that everybody's in the same place. Because if you start with tight guidelines, usually what happens is everybody does something, starts off the same, and all of a sudden it just explodes into all kinds of different directions, and you discover some talent that you didn't know was there, and sometimes the kids didn't know was there.
Yeah, so I think Sonia kind of talks about how they started with some guidelines. Now she says tight guidelines. They couldn't have been that tight if the students were able to take it, but they started with those guidelines and then really let kids take that composition activity where they wanted to.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do one more. So this is Robbie Burns, and Robbie was actually episode 14. Okay, also talking about some composing activities he did.
And you can say things like, okay, if it's in the key of concert B flat, the first and the last note have to be a concert B flat. But the second you start doing that, you realize how arbitrary those rules are, because it's like, well, not all music in the key of B flat starts or even ends on the note B flat. And all of your rules make no sense. But what is happening is you're sort of giving them as many of the common characteristics of a thing so that they can learn to appreciate that thing when maybe they witness it outside of context, where it doesn't have all of the features and parameters that you've set out for them. One of our flute players would always just finish each step of this process early. So she finishes her 8-measure flute melody like within 15 minutes, and it's like really actually very good. And so I'm like, all right, well, what can you make it 16 measures? And she's like, well, why 16? And then we're talking a little bit about that. And then she takes just a few more minutes to make it good. And then I said, okay, well, why don't you just like tell me like what this sounds like a lot of things we played in band. What is the tuba doing? And then she kind of sings me, what could be a tuba part. And I said, great, write it. Here's how you add the tuba. And then, she's doing like 2 or 3 voices. So, you can differentiate for the different kids.
Yeah.
Exactly what you just said, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's also those just in time things, right? Like then you're talking about phrasing, because the kid's like, I want to understand phrasing now, because why 16 measures, or texture, or I want to talk about, or like dynamics, or the importance of balance, right? There's all these things that kind of come up when in just right moments. That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and Robbie was again talking about giving some guidance and some guidelines to what the students were doing, but they weren't limited to that, right? Even the whole starting and ending on B flat thing, right? You say it, you recognize it, but then you acknowledge that it's not always the case.
Yeah.
So I think just thinking about how we incorporate creative activities and how we can give students enough guidance, but not too many rules to really stifle what they're capable of.
Yeah.
Okay, here's our fourth mistake. And this is something that I've had to like really think about with my language. And those of you who've been listening to podcasts have probably heard us mention it. And it's this idea that ownership is something that we can give students, right? Or that it's something that students have to earn. So if ownership is something that we give, then we're also implying that it can be taken away. And if that's the case, it's not actually student ownership, right? And the same idea is if we're saying, oh, well, they have to earn the opportunity to make these choices. They have to earn this. So making like compliance a requirement for ownership. I think we have to remember that student ownership is a mindset that we go into this with, that, we believe that all students should have some kind of ownership. All students have a voice. They should all be able to make choices. Our job is still, we are still the teachers. We are still, it's not diminishing what we do. But if we make it something that students have to earn, it's still putting all of the power in our hands.
Yeah. And I think when people ask us about, well, isn't your class chaotic when everyone they're driving their own learning, right, in the classroom and taking ownership of their learning, or taking ownership. I just said that, right? Like, well, that's
well, no, students taking ownership. Yeah,
they can do that. I can't. Yeah. But that they need I think with ownership, the behavior and the compliance, I think we would say, is, when they're invested in what they're doing, you will have students that are with you, right? And so sometimes, people say, well, I don't want to give them ownership. I'm saying, because the student's not ready, they haven't earned it. But if we allow that to happen, you will see kids invested, and some of that complacent behavior that you're worried about or need to have or feel to have in the room. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's something that happens when you give kids that, but when the kids have that ownership, it changes their whole way of being in the room.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, we're not diminishing your role as a teacher.
No,
you are still a really important part of the equation. But I think just having the mindset that ownership isn't something that's earned, it's not something that we can take away, that it's our way of being, I think can be, it's just really worth considering and remembering. Scott Edgar, back in episode 27, I thought he said it really well.
The finish line is student empowerment. But one thing that I just want to take a moment to say, that student empowerment, it cannot be something that teachers give. It's not like, I empower you. No, because that's still holding us in a space of power. Student empowerment is something that happens when we pull ourselves out of the equation and we see what emerges, and students' own skill sets.
Yeah. I like when he says, I empower you. No, you're right. That's not how it goes. But like, again, Scott, we pull ourselves out of that equation, and we see what happens. And I think that's when it's magical, right?
Yeah. I mean, again, there's a busy classroom, but they're busy classroom with purpose, with kids who are highly invested in what they're doing and know what their next steps are and all those amazing things. Yeah. It's fun to see.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to leave you with a quote. Okay. So this was written by Susan O'Neill for the Oxford Handbook of Social Justice in Music Education. I think she also says it really well. In music education, the notion of empowerment as enabling is often undermined when it's referred to as something that should be achieved or promoted by music teachers. Similarly, the idea that music learners become agents of their own learning can also be misinterpreted or misunderstood if teachers merely allow their students to choose some of their own repertoire or a song to bring into the classroom. Merely allowing youth to engage in decisions or choosing a learning activity does not equate with empowerment. To have power in its true sense means that there is no need for it to be allowed. Allowing youth opportunities to influence and participate in decisions implies that this is a privilege that can also be withdrawn by powerful others. If youth are to be empowered, their equitable engagement needs to be assured, not allowed. When I first read that, I think it was last summer, it impacted me, and it's made me think about it a lot. So that's why if I hear someone say, oh, well, they can have this once they earn it, I go, oh, but, and it kind of just makes me think, like, how can we shift that mindset so that it's truly assured and not just something we're allowing to happen.
Yeah.
Okay, so should we recap the four mistakes to avoid?
Yes, please.
Okay, mistake number 1, asking for student voice and then not listening to it. Mistake number 2, this illusion of choice when we're only ever offering kind of superficial teacher selected choices. Mistake number 3, giving either too much or not enough guidance for creative activities. And then mistake number 4, viewing ownership as something that students have to earn or something that we can give and then take away. And, these are things that I will think about every day, and I'm sure you will too, right?
Yep, for sure.
I think none of us are immune to it, but just kind of keeping these things in the back of our head as how we can really be working to create this environment where the students do feel like they have ownership, and we really are in some place that's learner-centered that we are supporting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like you said, it's something we think about every day. And it's something that I love to have conversations with you and others about to just kind of keep me moving and keep me reflecting on what I do.
Absolutely. Well, this was fun, wasn't it?
It was a lot of fun.
Okay, so before we kind of wrap up, just a reminder to everybody listening, there's show notes in the podcast player, or they're right below the video in YouTube. Also, if you liked today's interview, please consider leaving a review, subscribe, follow, all of that good stuff, because that really does help, especially those reviews. It helps get this message out to more people, gives, shows this podcast to more potential listeners. So that you can really help us with.
Yeah. And we also have the Buy Me a Coffee site. So for less than a cup of coffee, you can send us some support, which helps with expenses and hosting fees.
Yep.
And we greatly appreciate it.
Yes. All right. Thanks, everybody.
If you liked today's episode, you will love the PassTheBatonBook.com website, where you can find free resources, coaching services, and how to support Pass the Baton. Speaking of support, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. Thanks again for listening.